Hello, students. I am Gyan from English Magus. Welcome to today's video lesson on Herbert George Wells' fascinating story, Footprints Without Feet. This story is a part of your Class 10 English curriculum, Chapter 5 in English Language and Literature book Footprints Without Feet, and delves into the intriguing adventures of a scientist who discovers the secret to invisibility. We'll cover the chapter's overview, a detailed paragraph-wise explanation, and explore the figures of speech used by the author. Let's dive into the mysterious world by knowing a little about its author. Herbert George Wells was a prolific English writer known for his works in science fiction. Some of his most famous novels include The War of the Worlds, The Time Machine, and The Invisible Man. Wells' background in science and his imaginative storytelling made him a pioneer of the science fiction genre. His works often explored the potential and pitfalls of scientific advancements, questioning the ethical implications of new technologies. Wells passed away in 1946, leaving behind a legacy of thought-provoking literature. Before we delve into the detailed explanation, let's have a look at its overview to help you grasp its theme. Footprints Without Feet by Herbert George Wells tells the story of Griffin, a brilliant yet reckless scientist who discovers a way to make himself invisible. The story begins with two boys noticing muddy footprints that seemingly appear out of nowhere. As they follow the footprints, they learn about Griffin, who uses his newfound invisibility to escape various difficult situations. Despite his intelligence, Griffin's lack of morality leads him into more trouble, showcasing both the wonders and dangers of his discovery. Now we will begin the paragraph-wise explanation of the chapter. Before we begin the explanation of the text, I recommend you to pause and read text on each slide before listening to its explanation. This approach will enhance your understanding as we go through our detailed analysis. Let us begin the explanation now. And let me also tell you an interesting fact about the chapter. This chapter actually is an excerpt taken from the novel, The Invisible Man by Herbert George Wells. Let's start the chapter. The story begins with two boys noticing fresh muddy footprints on the steps of a house in London. The absence of a visible person leaves them bewildered. As they continue to observe, more footprints appear, leading them down the street until they eventually vanish. This sets the stage for the mystery of the Invisible Man. In these lines, the narrative reveals that the boys were unknowingly following Griffin, a scientist who had discovered the secret to making the human body invisible. Through numerous experiments and the ingestion of rare drugs, Griffin managed to turn his body as transparent as glass, while retaining its solid form. In these lines we learn that despite his scientific brilliance, Griffin lacked morals. After a dispute with his landlord, Griffin set the house on fire in retaliation. To escape unseen, he stripped off his clothes, becoming completely invisible. This act marked the beginning of his life as a homeless wanderer, entirely invisible, except when his muddy footprints gave him away. Griffin managed to evade the boys tracking his footprints. However, being invisible and naked in midwinter London posed significant challenges. To survive the cold, he sought refuge in a large department store, where he could find warmth and clothes. These lines explain after the store closed, Griffin took advantage of the situation by helping himself to clothes, food, and other necessities. He dressed in warm clothing, making himself visible once again, and enjoyed a hearty meal before sleeping comfortably on a pile of quilts. His actions reflect his disregard for law and order. Here we learn that tired Griffin overslept and could not wake up before the arrival of the assistants. When he woke up, the assistants were already running to capture him. In his panic to avoid capture, he stripped off his clothes, becoming invisible again, and fled into the cold January morning. This incident highlights the continuous cycle of Griffin's struggles due to his invisibility. In these lines we find Griffin desperate for clothes and figuring out a way to disguise his invisibility. He headed to a theatrical company, where he found a shop and equipped himself with bandages, glasses, a false nose, and other accessories to conceal his invisibility. To cover his escape, he attacked and robbed the shopkeeper, further illustrating his lack of ethics. In this section of the chapter we find Griffin in search of solitude and safety. He traveled to the village of Iping. He booked 2 rooms at a local inn. His strange appearance attracted attention, but he didn't entertain any friendly behavior, claiming he wanted to be left alone due to an accident that had disfigured his face. Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper, thought Griffin to be an eccentric scientist. Despite his peculiar behavior and irritable temper, Mrs. Hall was willing to overlook it because he had paid in advance. However, Griffin's stolen money quickly ran out, and he confessed to having no more cash. To save face, he pretended to expect a check imminently, even though the reality was quite different. In these lines we see how Griffin, needing money, stole from a clergyman's house early in the morning. The clergyman and his wife were shocked to find their money missing despite no visible thief in the room. This incident adds to the growing mystery and suspicion surrounding Griffin. In this part, we see the clergyman's reaction to the strange theft at his house. All day, he kept saying, "What a strange event." But even stranger things were happening in Griffin's room. Early the next morning, the innkeeper and his wife were surprised to find the door to Griffin's room wide open. Usually, he kept it locked and got very angry if anyone tried to enter. Unable to resist, they peeked inside but found no one there. Curious, they explored further. They noticed that the bed was cold, showing Griffin had been gone for a while, and his clothes and bandages were scattered around. This strange sight left them even more puzzled about Griffin and his odd behavior. In these lines we learn Mrs. Hall experienced what she believed to be supernatural events in Griffin's room, with objects moving on their own and attacking her. Terrified, she and her husband were convinced that Griffin had somehow enchanted the furniture. This confirms the villagers' suspicions about Griffin. In these lines we find villagers grew increasingly suspicious of Griffin, suspecting him of witchcraft or involvement in the clergyman's burglary. Their doubts were heightened when Griffin produced cash despite claiming to have none earlier. This led to the summoning of the village constable. In these lines we see the drama unfolding further. Without waiting for the constable, Mrs. Hall marched straight to the scientist, who had mysteriously materialized from his previously empty bedroom. Her voice was firm, and she demanded answers for the mysterious and unusual happening. The scientist, always prone to quick temper, now seethed with fury. In a swift motion, he discarded bandages, whiskers, spectacles, and even his nose. It took him a mere minute. The horrified people in the bar found themselves gaping at a headless man. This revelation shocked and terrifies the onlookers. In the last section of the chapter, Constable Jaffers arrived to arrest Griffin, only to discover he was dealing with an invisible man. Despite his best efforts, Jaffers struggled to capture Griffin, who continued to remove his clothes and vanish completely. The scene turned chaotic, with Griffin escaping once more, leaving everyone bewildered and unable to catch him. The chapter ends here. Thank you for joining today's lesson on Footprints Without Feet by H.G. Wells. We explored the fascinating story of Griffin, a scientist who discovers the secret to invisibility and the consequences that follow. We discussed the chapter's detailed explanations, biographical sketch of the author. Remember, the story not only entertains but also teaches us about the ethical implications of scientific discoveries. Keep practicing and exploring literature to enhance your understanding. Here is the list of literary devices used in the chapter. Pause the video and go through it, and stay tuned for more entertaining explanations of our upcoming lessons. Thank you for joining us. Kindly like and subscribe if you found the lesson helpful. See you in the next lesson.